As long as there's been Yu-Gi-Oh, there have been players claiming it's not as good as it used to be. When Synchros came out, players were told the game was dead in the water and wouldn't survive the recession. After Xyz released, we were lectured about how their weird levels and negligent deck building cost meant the game was doomed to die before the end of the Obama administration, and don't get me started on pendulums. As we end up on the other side of the 25th anniversary of Yugi allowing another man into his body, it's clear rumors of Yu-Gi-Oh's death at the hands of new mechanics were greatly exaggerated. But Yu-Gi-Oh's survival wasn't always a given. There was one other summoning type, the time the boy actually saw a wolf that threatened both the health of the metagame and the strength of the IP itself: Link Monsters. Link Monsters were released in 2017, and at base, they're the simplest of any other summoning condition. You make them by using the material on the card, no polymerization, no tuners, no levels, no fucking scales. Unfortunately, they were just a little too simple, and their print precipitated format after format of FTKs, a never-ending string of nonsense decks built on the back of old cards that weren't designed with Link Monsters in mind. Today, I want to talk about arguably the most heinous of any of these formats, enabled by a decades-old card and a magazine promotion that lasted all of one weekend. This is the story of Yu-Gi-Oh's best deck that lasted 72 hours. Let's take a quick step back in time. Back before Links, Pendulums, Xyz, or Synchros, Yu-Gi-Oh! Wasn't yet a worldwide phenomenon. It was a weekly series in Shonen Jump. This magazine is so instrumental to the DNA of Yu-Gi-Oh! That early championship series were called Shonen Jump Championships. And as Yu-Gi-Oh! Exploded outward from a forgettable weekly to an international darling, Shonen Jump cashed in. Starting in 2003, some issues of Shonen Jump came with a promotional Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, legal for play at events. The non-Zoomers among you may remember the Scholastic Book Fair, and that one kid in your class who would unwrap the SJs, take the promo, and put them back on the shelf. Kevin. Anyway, these cards were frequently the subject of some of the most egregious scalping 11-year-olds could perform. If the card at issue was even remotely playable, it often commanded an enormous price tag and was largely unavailable to the general public, at least for a few months. This practice outlasted the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga and continued well into 2017, where the first part of our story takes place. In December, Shonen Jump's Yu-Gi-Oh! Promo was an unassuming Link retrain of the fan-favorite Kuriboh called Linkuriboh. Genius. And almost immediately, there was a problem.
And it doesn't limit itself away from tokens,
which allows you to use any level 1 monster, so that's a really big deal.
This card is going to make spirals even more broken than they are before.
Linkuriboh was what we call a Link 1 monster, able to be summoned using only a single monster on your side of the field. The negligible investment means they've got to be incredibly restrictive as to their summoning material in order to be balanced, and Linkuriboh was not. It required a level 1 monster in order to be summoned, and could summon itself from the graveyard by tributing a level 1 monster from your side of the field. Functionally, it was 2 monsters that only ate up 1 extra deck slot. But what level 1 monster could fit the bill? This is where the second player in our combo appears, Level Eater. Level Eater is an effect monster that can target a level 5 or higher monster you control, decrease its level by 1, then summon itself from the graveyard. Players were not unfamiliar with this card. It was a power player in a half-dozen off-meta synchro spam decks, but its applications with Linkuriboh turned it from a king of jank into a format-warping super threat. So, we've got a Link 1 that can be summoned over and over again, and a level 1 that can be infinitely spammed from the graveyard under the right conditions. We've got the Fizzle material, now how do we perform Cold Fusion? Well, I'm glad you asked. See, during 2017, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was played under what we called Master Rule 4, a macro rule which required any monster summoned from the extra deck to be summoned to the extra monster zone, a zone found above the 2nd and 4th zones of the game board. This requirement was waived, provided you summoned to a zone a Link monster pointed to, so in this way, an end board artificially set to one big boss could instead stretch across your whole game board, and occasionally to your opponents as well. If you were able to use Link monsters to point all the way from the Link zone opposite your own, you could claim it, summoning your own boss to your opponent's extra monster zone, thereby locking them from their extra deck entirely. This strategy, called extra linking, has been popular a few times over Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, but never as efficiently as it was with Linkuriboh and Level Eater. Now, all players needed to commit a war crime at their locals was a shell in which to play these 2 bad boys. Ideally, such a deck would have an easy way to get Linkuriboh into the graveyard, and the ability to summon multiple monsters with huge numbers of stars, and it turned out there was no shortage of either. Dark Lord was an early contender for best Level Eater spam shell. This deck drew dozens of cards through use of Ixchel and Allure of Darkness, all but guaranteeing you could find the Eater. After getting a Dark Lord Superbia into the graveyard, it could be reborn with Dark Lord Contact, bringing another big body along with it. Eat Superbia's stats, Ixchel Contact, eat Ixchel stats, then reborn the Superbia and do it again. Cosmo was another candidate for level eatery. This deck benefits from cards that pop your own monsters, so it was an obvious fit for the then new True King monsters, usually using the level eater to snack on a Cosmo before popping it and ending on an Extra Link and a VFD. Fun! Of course, there were other decks that fit the mold for these two. Blue Eyes wanted to be playing Linkuriboh anyway for stone plays, and 8 stars is a lot. Infernoid could summon extra bodies under their 8-star lock after level eater got peckish. But ultimately, my favorite of these lists was Kaiju. This deck could, from a hand of level eater and an interrupted Kaiju Slumber, perform an Extra Link and find follow-up, and unlike most of the other builds, had game going second. The stage was set for an entire format of level eatery. Just one problem remained. When was it going to be playable? See, Yu-Gi-Oh cards don't become legal as soon as you get them in your grubby little hands. They become legal when a date appears on the Konami database, and in Linkuriboh's case, it just wasn't there. There are a couple of guesses as to why. Jump promos aren't always meta-defining, often they're not worth the cardboard they're printed on. This one was historically powerful, and if it became legal at a time when some people hadn't yet purchased the magazine, it was going to be a big problem. There weren't really any important events in the December and January months, so a Linkuriboh release weekend wasn't going to generate a lot of hype. And finally, because this card was only distributed through the Jump promo, any nation that didn't have Jump distribution was SOL until a reprint set, like all of Europe. Basically, Konami was none too keen on breaking the metagame, but after months of purgatory, relented. Linkuriboh was finally scheduled for legality on Friday, February 2nd, 2018. Then Konami released something else. Right before this format-destroying super threat became legal, they unveiled a new ban list. It was a doozy, stopping the currently dominant Spiral in its tracks, taking care of a pesky Pendulum deck, and squashing Linkuriboh's partner in crime, Level Eater. It looked like the greatest deck in Yu-Gi-Oh's history was never going to come to pass after all, right? Well, not exactly. See, Linkuriboh became legal Friday the 2nd, and the ban list went into effect Monday the 5th. So for an extremely brief 3-day period, dedicated duelists could play with the terrible twosome together. That is, if you could find an event. There wasn't anything Premier level during that time, no YCSs. You could sweep up a locals, I guess, but that's hardly much of an accomplishment. Unfortunately, if you wanted to let Level Eater out of its cage, you only had one choice. 3 regional tournaments held on February 3rd. Rosemont, Charlotte, and Seattle. For a mere 72 hours, you had a chance to take advantage of 2 of Yu-Gi-Oh's most powerful playmakers. How did it go? Well, let's hear from some duelists who were there. So you were at Rosemont, right?
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, you played FA at that event?
This was the era of the $200 whip crosser. I remember it well.
So while you didn't see a lot of success with FA, your friend did really well, and I think ended up getting something like 3rd place at this event. Did they see any of this Linkuriboh Level Eater deck?
Honestly, when you originally brought this up, I did not know which deck you were talking about. This event was, as best as I can remember, it was the last weekend of Spiral, so there were some Spiral players. It was also the first weekend of Electromite, so almost all the top tables were Pendulums. And then the other deck that was like in a clear 3rd place was the early Trickstar builds. At that time, they were actually playing like Eater of Millions as like removal. This is like pre-Sky Striker, but post Spiral format. So yeah, it was, I literally had no idea what you were talking about when you asked about a level Eater Linkuriboh deck.
So you were at one of the events during the week of February 3rd, 2018, right?
Yes, I should be at Chicago or Rosemont. It was during the World's Grind for 2018. World's points, bro.
And in collecting those points, I imagine you were playing the best deck in the room, which was, of course, Level Eater Linkuriboh.
Are you sure it wasn't Pendulum FTK?
So what happened? How did a deck this dominant, this explosive, this unbeatable failed to do much of anything? Well, firstly, it was expensive. Linkuriboh cost a pretty penny. While there were enough copies in circulation that anyone who wanted to snag a copy had one, they came at a cost. Vendors with dozens of Shonen Jump subscriptions were selling the card for $40 a piece, and you'd need 3 of them alongside 3 Firewall Dragon for a deck with a shelf life about the length of the TikTok ban. Secondly, it was boring. This deck did one thing and one thing only. Spent 15 minutes spinning its wheels to set up a near FTK. Spiral could pick apart boards with ease. Pendulum's lines were incredibly malleable, but this deck settled into an assembly line of level eating almost immediately. And finally, so what was your impression of this Linkuriboh Level Eater Link Spam deck?
It's not even a question. It's utter garbage. It's a crack addict deck where you would just spam summons and you'd feel like you were accomplishing a lot because you're summoning a million times, but your deck wasn't good. It wasn't resilient to removal. It wasn't resilient to negation because at least back then, there wasn't really an array of Link monsters you could choose from. Your interruptions were just Firewall and Trigate, and like if your opponent had like the targeted answers to those cards, your deck did nothing. On top of the many other flaws the deck has, like you needing to set up a high-level monster with a level leader and then that has to stick.
All the usual suspects of prognosticating Tier 0 tournaments were out in full force, explaining how stupid you'd be to even attempt to play something else. But let's examine what this deck does with a little more scrutiny. To set up the extra link, players often placed a Gaia Saber the Lightning Shadow in one extra monster zone, but by the time you made it over to the other, there weren't enough zones to make another guy. As a result, the last monster in the link was usually Linkuriboh himself. That meant you could just walk over it. Speaking of the battle phase, a staple second tool Evenly Matched had just been released, and while Trigate has a negate attached to it, baiting it out wasn't too difficult. Finally, some of the top played decks in the format didn't care at all. This was a time when True Draco was still seeing success. Trickstar was becoming playable. Oh no, not my extra monster zone. This sentiment was corroborated by every single person that I talked to. As a nail in the coffin, Linkuriboh level leader ultimately wasn't even the most effective FTK at these events. Pendulum had an FTK that was reasonably popular, and as a result was hit hard in February, prompting would-be Linkuriboh FTKers to instead pivot to Pendulum's last hurrah. So there it is, a deck forecast to destroy the game, cut down before its prime, legal for exactly one weekend, whose impact on the game's history amounts to being the second best FTK at a regional won by Pendulums. Yu-Gi-Oh's history is littered with what-if formats that lasted a fortnight, Grinder Golem, Priorata Makiora, but never has one been so hyped and fallen so flat. Sometimes a series of cascading events and decisions cause the stars to align into a constellation of total shit. Of absolute doo-doo. If you were at any of these events, let me know in the comments. In researching this video, I was stunned by the amount of people with anecdotes about running around, scrounging for Linkuriboh upsales, and claiming they were going to quit when the level leader combo became legal. I love these very human stories about very mundane events. So how do you remember it? For me, it was one hell of a weekend.